brief overview of the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. When World War II ended, it was clear to the United States and the other allies, France, England, the other allied nations, that Russia, the Soviet Union, was their next enemy. So they were basically enemies. By the time the war ended, they were already enemies. So America quickly organized NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to help face the threat of a Soviet invasion of Europe. This kicked off the Cold War, and it lasted for years and years. It ended in the 80s with the collapse of the Soviet Union. When the collapse happened, there were countries that were part of the Soviet Union broke off into their own countries, Russia being the largest and most powerful of the countries. But Ukraine was one of those countries that broke off. And because it had nuclear weapons stationed in it, it kind of became a country with nuclear weapons. So, and I'm, by the way, this is incredibly brief, and I'm oversimplifying lots of things, and I may be messing some of these dates up, so don't trust the dates too much. I'm doing this from memory. So, the United States promised Ukraine, because the United States wanted to get nuclear weapons out of as many people's hands as possible. So the United States promised Ukraine that we would support them and we would protect them from invasion. And we promised them that in order to get them to give up their nuclear weapons. And they did. They believed us, and they gave up their nuclear weapons. Flash forward. So the reason Russia liked having border buffers between NATO and Russia. And that's going to come into play a little later. But that was a big part of the way the Soviet Union broke up, is there was a buffer between any NATO country and Russia. As a matter of fact, the United States even promised Russia that they would always leave a buffer, a country that was not a NATO country, between a NATO country and Russia. And that was part of kind of getting them to back down on a lot of, and kind of encouraging them to stop their kind of militant push and Cold War stuff. So and I'm going to tell this from two perspectives. Okay, so the first perspective is from the kind of NATO's perspective. So NATO has been adding members and growing in power and kind of putting together this military bloc that is with the idea that if they get it big enough, and NATO countries basically promise that if they go to war with Russia, or really anybody else, but it's particularly focused on Russia, that if they go to war with Russia, everyone will go to war with Russia. So it's an all or nothing thing. So the more you have, the more people you have. If everyone lives up to that promise, then the bigger you are, the more protection you have against anybody doing anything to you, because you are big and bad, and everybody knows that everybody's going to help you. So go back to about 10, 11 years ago, maybe more than that. Russia invaded Crimea. And their logic was, hey, there's a lot of people who live here that speak Russian. There are people here who are migrated from Russia. A lot of people here who kind of think of Russia as being home. They think of themselves as being Russian. So we are going to take this. And it took about 2 weeks. Not a lot of resistance was made, very little, really. And eventually the Ukrainian government said, okay, fine, you can keep it. Just don't invade the rest of us. Basically, Ukraine gave up. They just folded and gave up. And Russia, and when they did that, the United States, they first looked to the United States and said, come help us. And the United States said, yeah, we're not going to help you. I know we promised to help you, and that's why you gave up your nuclear weapons. And if you had nuclear weapons, Russia would have invaded you, but we're not going to come help. We're not going to go start a giant war about this. So Ukraine kind of had expected America to help, and we didn't. So then what was left of Ukraine really focused on saying, okay, well, we can't depend on America to save us. We need to build our own government. We need to build our own culture. We need to build a sense of being Ukrainian so that if this happens again, we can fight against Russia. So, from the American perspective, the NATO perspective, Ukraine wants to be part of NATO. They want that security, they want that protection, and they're willing to do a lot to get it. So they want to be there. So they've really been asking and wanting to join. From the Russian perspective, the United States had promised them, NATO had promised them that there would always be a buffer. But now you got Ukraine talking about joining NATO. Well, that would put NATO right on the border of Ukraine. And specifically the way the geography is, that would really give them just an absolute foothold in Russia. It would make defending Russia almost impossible. So Russia's thinking, we can't have this. So Russia sent money and weapons and even troops into the inside of Ukraine, but in the bordering provinces where a lot of those people speak Russian and think of themselves as being Russian. So they encouraged civil war in Ukraine, and there has been civil war in Ukraine, which with the idea of carving off the border, the parts of Ukraine that kind of touch Russia, and making a buffer there by having those people, by carving off those people there. And then if Ukraine joined NATO, it wouldn't matter. They'd still have some sort of buffer. So Russia moved its troops up to the border on a regular basis for years. They've been building up troops on the border of Ukraine, and then they'd sit there for a couple days, couple weeks, couple months, and then they would pull them off, and they would just do that over and over and over. So when they did this about a year ago, a little over a year ago, I guess now, everyone assumed that it was just another one of those exercises, including the Russian soldiers themselves. And as often happens with authoritarian governments, the military often lies about its own capabilities and readiness because no one wants to be the bearer of bad news. So as this giant Russian force amassed on the border, and then the order came down to invade, I think it surprised everyone. At least it appears as if it surprised the military units. It appears as if they were lying about their capabilities. They were lying about the amount of fuel they had. They were lying about how good the vehicles were and that they were ready for an invasion. They were even lying about how much food they had because they didn't have enough food to feed everybody. The invasion was an absolute failure. It was crazy, terrible, bad. Now, they took a lot of Ukrainian territory, but they should have conquered, it should have been so overwhelming that just like before, where 2 weeks later, it was all over and Ukraine had surrendered Crimea, the same thing as should have happened in the eastern parts of Ukraine, maybe even the whole country of Ukraine. But Ukraine fought back, and once NATO saw that Ukraine had the will to fight, NATO started pouring resources into Ukraine. Weapons, tanks, missiles, artillery, ammunition, everything. And everything except for long-range missiles and aircraft that could become offensive. So we didn't provide anything that could be used to invade Russia, because we don't want them to invade Russia, because Russia has said they'll use nuclear weapons if somebody invades them, and nobody wants a nuclear war. So, the first invasion went terrible. There was winter came, and they were able to winter makes everything wet and cold and mushy, so tanks and trucks all get stuck in the mud. It becomes very hard to move, and you really can only move if you have really good roads to drive on, which there's not a ton of, or if you're in cities. So a lot of the combat comes to a halt unless it's in a city. So also a big part of this is so the United States put sanctions on Russia when they invaded. We did it first during Crimea, kind of half-heartedly, and then now when they invaded Ukraine, the United States put all kinds of sanctions on Russia, and it was devastating to their economy. So devastating that Russia got together with other countries, India, Pakistan, South Africa. I don't know about South Africa, actually. There's a couple African countries. We got together with those countries and China, and this is all super complicated. So prior to all this, the only way you could buy oil in the world is to use dollars. So you'd have to convert your currency into dollars and then buy the oil in dollars. That's how oil was sold, was in dollars. Russia got together with these other countries, all that don't like us, and they formed, I think it's called BRIC. And BRIC is basically a cooperative of governments that said, you know what, we're going to trade oil in the currency other than the dollar. Primarily the ruble, the Russian ruble. So this was a big deal because it kind of threatens the U.S. dollar as being the currency, the reserve currency of the world. Because typically countries would buy a bunch of dollars because they needed the dollars to do world commerce and stuff. And the dollar was always safe and secure. But now, and it's what you had to buy oil in. Now, this whole scheme challenged that. Well, the United States puts, that was in response to the sanctions, because we basically said you can't, we're not going to play nice. No one's going to do business with you. So the Russians said, well, we'll build our own system to do business in the global environment. Those sanctions, though, really have impacted Russia, but they also impact other people. Russia exports, Europe typically bought 30 to 40% of its energy from Russia. Russia exports energy and food. Germany, other developing countries depended on Russian natural gas to heat its homes in the winter and to run its power plants. So everyone kind of thought, oh my gosh, when Russia turns off the spigot, which is what they did, they turned off that natural gas. They thought, God, we're going to have, people are going to be dying in Germany, and they're going to break the will of Germany because of the cold winter. But the winter was incredibly mild, and the United States and other countries stepped up to help provide and sell energy to these European countries. So instead of losing 30 to 40% of their energy, they only lost like 6%, which was enough that they could figure out the difference. So the sanctions have really impacted Russia and really kind of made them a non-player internationally, at least for now. The mild winter gave everybody long enough to recover and figure out other ways to take care of their energy needs. And Ukraine has now survived for a long time and are in a position to be able to withstand the So the sanctions have really impacted Russia and given Europe a chance to replace what it depended on Russia for. Also, Ukraine is a huge exporter of grain, of food. Russia controlled the Black Sea. Everybody assumed that Russia was going to embargo or blockade Ukraine and prevent them from selling food, and may end up starving parts of the country. That has not happened. Russia has actually withdrawn its fleet. They cannot protect their fleet. And grain shipments have continued. There have been some losses, but relatively small from what you would anticipate. A lot of that's because Ukraine has become very efficient, and this is the first time in war it's been a major impact of using drones to do battle. So weaponized drones, this is the first time they've had a huge impact in the battlefield. Ukraine has become very good at taking commercial drones, so things you can buy on Amazon for $350, and making them weapons, making them be able to drop grenades and other explosives, and using them for surveillance, and taking boats, spending $5,000 and building a drone boat that can sink a large military vessel. There's something called asymmetric warfare, which is where I spend a very little amount of money to cost you a lot of money. So I spend $350 on a drone, I strap explosives to it, I fly it over your expensive tank, and I blow up my drone and blow up your tank. That's called asymmetric warfare. So it's not two big tanks going at each other. One has a little bitty force that's fast and cheap, and it takes out the big, heavy, expensive force of the other person. So we kind of see that going on now. So yeah, that kind of brings us to where we are. Russia has taken territory, and Ukraine has kind of pushed back. Ukraine also has spread out. Instead of collecting all of its forces in one big mass and trying to take land back, Ukraine has spread its forces out across all of its border with contested border with Russia, and is making Russia spread its forces thin, and really has done a great job. Ukraine has done an amazing job at resisting a much, much larger force. There's questions about how long that can last. Russia has a much larger army and a much larger population to draw from. There's a lot of questions on how long this can last. There's also questions about whether the United States can continue to give hundreds of billions of dollars in foreign aid, especially now that Israel is at war or has entered into war with Gaza. And traditionally, the United States has always favored helping Israel over other countries.